Good afternoon, greetings. I am Neville Hode, a professor in the English department at the University of Texas and co-PI on this pop-up institute with Rudrappa Center co-director and law professor Karen Engel. We are pleased to welcome you to our keynote address this afternoon, which comes at the midpoint of our 3-week pop-up institute, sponsored by the UT Office of the Vice President for Research, to whom we are extremely grateful. And our wonderful Assistant Director, Sarah Eliason, will put the schedule in the chat so you can see what we've been up to. Although Sarita Gupta will deliver a keynote address, we are delighted that she will also be in conversation with many who have been involved with the Pop-Up Institute as well as the audience. Here's a quick sketch of the program. I'll introduce Sarita, who will then speak for 30 minutes. Karen will then moderate a discussion with Sarita and some of our cluster representatives, and then we will open it to the audience. All right, I imagine at this point we are all familiar, if not overly familiar, with Zoom, but I will give a few Zoom instructions. Okay, we made this a meeting as opposed to a webinar so that our presenters can see the audience during the Q&A. So please mute your mics during the actual talk. Ambient noise can be entertaining and life breaks through, but we want to listen. And you could keep your cameras on or off, we don't mind, but please turn them on for the Q&A so our presenters can see you. During the conversation, you should feel free to type general comments to everyone in the chat. Since we aren't all good multitaskers though, send any questions for Sarita or our other speakers directly to Karen, or you can raise your hands. If the camera function is on, you could do it literally, or otherwise there's that little raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen. If watching from YouTube, enter your questions in the YouTube chat, and our student team member will pass them along to Karen. We're also live tweeting this event, and folks can join the conversation on Twitter. Sarah will drop the Twitter handle in the chat. We have a lot going on this week, so I refer you to our website and the program that Sarah's going to drop in the chat. Okay, that's all the housekeeping I have. It is no small pleasure to welcome Sarita Gupta to deliver the keynote lecture for our Pop-Up Institute. Thinking about future of work and workers and worker activism and organizing is impossible without engaging her contributions. It would take up too much of our time with her if I tried to list them all. So once again, Sarah will put one of her bios in the chat. Sarita Gupta is a nationally recognized expert on the economic, labor, and political issues affecting working people, and is widely acknowledged as a key leader and strategist in the progressive movement. She is currently the director of the Ford Foundation's Future of Work and Workers program, leading the team that oversees Ford's efforts to actively shape a future of work that puts workers and their well-being at the center, which is reflected in the title of her lecture today, which you will see. Sarita joined the foundation with more than 20 years of experience working to expand people's ability to come together to improve their workplaces, their communities, and their lives. She has deep expertise and commitments in policy advocacy, organizing, and building partnerships across the workers' rights and care movements. Having served as executive director of Jobs with Justice and co-director of Caring Across Generations with Ajahn Poo, whom some of you might recall from her Fahrenfeld lecture at the Rudrappa Center in 2017. In our preparatory meetings with Sarita about this talk, we solicited from her the information that she is both a soccer player and is the coach of her 11-year-old daughter's team. I don't know where she finds the time, but that information may have some explanatory power. Eduardo Galeano, the great poet of inequality, and actually to my mind, the best poet of inequality in the 20th century, and author of The Open Veins of Latin America, is arguably more famous as the poet laureate of soccer. In his 1995 book, Soccer in Sun and Shadow, he writes, "Tell me how you play and I'll tell you who you are. For many years, soccer has been played in different styles. unique expressions of the personality of each people. And the preservation of that diversity seems to be more necessary today than ever before. These are days of obligatory uniformity in soccer and everything else. Never has the world been so unequal in the opportunities it offers and so equalizing in the habits it imposes. In this end of century world, whoever does not die of hunger dies of boredom. End quote. For Galeano, soccer is both its own magic and symbol of the worlds of life and work, individual artistry and national destiny. The title of Sarita Gupta's talk today is Workers at the Center, Reimagining the Future of Work, and will help us all imagine a future of work and workers where opportunity is more equitably distributed, where work can express our different styles and unique personalities, and where neither boredom nor hunger is an inevitable outcome. With no further ado, I'm very excited to hear from Sarita Gupta on Workers at the Center, Reimagining the Future of Work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Neville, for that very warm introduction. And what a beautiful connection to name and share that lovely quote from Galeano in terms of the passion of soccer that I have. And anyway, we can talk more soccer later. But thank you for that warm introduction. And a huge thanks to you and Karen for inviting me to join you today. So I lead the Ford Foundation's Future of Workers program, and many of the issues we touch are reflected within the 5 clusters here at the Rudrappa Center, such as care work, the nature of work in the global South, and technology. Speaking of technology, we are glad about your information school's involvement in the Public Interest Technology University network we support, which aims to grow a new generation of civic-minded technologists. I would especially like to applaud the Rudrappa Center for bringing such a diverse audience to talk about the future of workers and work through this pop-up institute. Today, I'm hoping we can use our time together to explore how we, academics, technologists, government, business, civil society groups, can work together to advance solutions that speak to the challenges of today and shift societal beliefs about workers and work. You may be wondering why I say the future of workers and not future of work. This is intentional because we believe the future is fundamentally about people. Conversations about the future of work can sometimes focus on technology, since it's playing a rather visible role in transforming the world of work. These conversations are often framed around how businesses and employers can use technology to improve scale, productivity, and efficiencies, and deliver value for consumers and shareholders alike. Too often, we forget about the people who are actually doing the work that makes our economy function, low and middle income workers who have experienced more than 40 years of stagnant or declining pay, shrinking benefits, and reduced representation on the job. Work is one of the most commonly shared human experiences. Across the globe, most of us need to work for economic survival, but we also hope to gain dignity from being creative, solving problems, supporting our families, and making contribution to our communities. Though our experiences can differ greatly, work is a necessary activity that influences our lives and well-being. Therefore, we must think about the future of working people, whose future is inextricably linked to our ability to preserve democracy and realize more fair economies. Work as we know it is changing. It is being profoundly reshaped by the global pandemic. In addition to threats to public health, the economic and social disruption threatens the long-term livelihoods and well-being of millions. Yet, well before the pandemic, shifts in work have been driven by forces such as globalization, demographic change, technology and innovation, and climate change. So I want to share a quick word on each. Globalization has helped accelerate a shift in how work is structured. In many more advanced economies, the structure of work has shifted away from mega firms of the past, which employed and provided benefits for large workforces across a range of skills and income levels. You could think GM, for example. Work is shifting towards more nimble firms who keep a light footprint when it comes to employment, offering permanent jobs to a relatively small number of high-end managers and engineers and other office staff, while relying on a fluid army of contingent workers for everything else. Think Uber as an example. This trend towards fissuring, a term coined by American academic David Weil, is growing. Essentially, firms are constructing networks of subcontracting, outsourcing, and franchising that allow them to streamline operations and cut costs, specifically labor costs, by avoiding the responsibility once attached to the standard employment relationship of the past. As a result of this trend, we see a rise in contingent work that is more precarious and insecure. Increase in independent contractor classification, which matters in a legal context because in US labor law, they are excluded from collective bargaining rights since they are not employees. This means millions of workers are excluded from basic labor standards. Demographic shifts. With respect to demographic shifts, expanding youth populations in some parts of the world and aging populations in others are creating new pressures on labor markets and social security systems. Technology and innovation, while artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics will eliminate jobs, they are also poised to create new jobs. The question is whether or not these new jobs will be good quality jobs that provide people with what they need to live sustainable lives. Job creation is critical for our economy, yet often this discussion is framed as an either job creation or a job quality. We believe it is not an either or, but a both and. And with automation, AI, and robotics, those who lose their jobs in this transition may be the least equipped to seize the new jobs that are created. Therefore, it's important to create pathways for such workers to acquire new skills that match the jobs of tomorrow. More broadly, across geographies, sectors, labor activities, and classification, technology is reshaping work in ways that meet the needs of businesses and consumers alike, without concern for workers' interests. And finally, climate change. The greening of our economies as we adopt sustainable practices and clean technologies will create new jobs. However, other jobs will disappear as countries scale back their carbon and resource-intensive industries. So again, how do we create pathways for workers who will lose jobs to acquire new skills that match the jobs of tomorrow? These forces are, however, exacerbated by trends that are making our economy increasingly unequal, such as wealth concentration among the super rich. In the US, the top 1% holds more of the country's wealth than the bottom 90%. Market concentration, including the heightened power of tech monopolies, contributes to wage stagnation, limits entrepreneurship, increases the cost of living, and stifles innovation. And finally, growing financialization of the global economy, designed to maximize value for shareholders versus society at large. Consequently, work has become increasingly precarious, unsafe, and unsustainable for millions of people. Here in the US, we see wages have remained stagnant, are in some cases declining, right? We see this wage stagnation. People at the 40th percentile of the income distribution, so think bank tellers or preschool teachers, saw their incomes grow by just 0.3% per year from 1980 to 2018. While those in the top 0.1% saw their already large incomes quadruple over the same time. To further illustrate this point, 30% of domestic workers who make so much work in America possible, were found to rely on public assistance for food security. We see limited access to basic protections and benefits. In our country, where basic necessities such as health insurance and sick leave are tied to our work status, too many workers lack access to such basics. For instance, while 90% of professional workers have paid sick leave, only 27% of food service workers do. We also see outdated labor laws and protections. Labor laws have not kept pace with changes in the nature of work, the workforce, and workers' interests. For instance, gig workers, who were said to make up somewhere between 25 to 35% of the pre-pandemic workforce, are often classified as contractors, which prevents them from accessing basic benefits. They are also facing unpredictable schedules and variable pay. Let's be clear that US labor law history is rife with different groups of workers being carved out of protections because their work wasn't really seen as work. Will we build out a new generation of exclusions, or will we strive for more inclusive laws and policies? So let's talk globally for a moment. Globally, we see poor quality jobs. Low wages, poor working conditions, insufficient employment, and patchy social protection remain key drivers of poverty. Here are a few illustrative stats from the ILO. In terms of working poverty, there are 300 million workers who live in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 per day. There are 2.78 million workers who die every year due to occupational accidents or work-related illnesses. There are 190 million people who are unemployed, of whom 64.8 million are youth. There's a 20% gender pay gap that exists between men and women. And finally, 36.1% of the global workforce works excessive hours, more than 48 hours per week. We also see informality. Informal workers represent 61% of the world's workforce, or 2 billion workers globally. These workers are typically without healthcare, sick leave, childcare support, old age insurance, and basic labor protections. And we also see a lack of representation. The ability of working people to collectively bargain has declined. Workers in more than 50 countries faced violent repression, and union activists who were pushing for a new social and labor contract were murdered in 10 countries. These factors have reshuffled power relations among businesses, investors, labor, and civil society and consumers, creating new rules for the economy that we are contending with today. Workers are experiencing limited choices, a widening gender gap, lack of access to social protections, unsafe working conditions, and no or little labor protections. Therefore, if we hope to build a more just, fair, and equitable future, we must understand that the future is now. We must ensure our economy adequately caters to all stakeholders. Working people and communities should play a central role in shaping policy discussions, business decisions, and technology design. This is what we mean by centering workers. In order to keep the conversation focused on people, we need to ensure workers have both a seat and voice at the table concerning the future of work, our economy, and our governments. A seat at the table is fundamentally about representation, and voice is about influence. At the Ford Foundation, we seek to tackle inequality in all its forms. Having worked as an organizer, campaigner, and advocate for workers' rights for over 25 years, I'm fortunate to serve with a team that is committed to centering the voices and experiences of workers in shaping our economy and solutions for the future. We believe improving work is a critical part of a social justice agenda and integral to the health of our democracy and economy. A reimagined, more equitable system of work would empower workers with a real voice, compel employers to take appropriate responsibility for working conditions and living standards, and urge lawmakers to enact strong, effective policies and laws to fill any gaps. This new inclusive and equitable concept of work would value and protect people across sectors, classification, regions, and even the globe. For example, it would mean that care workers garner the same respect as office workers, that workers based in the US have the same rights as their peers in other nations, and workers who've been the least protected, including workers of color, women, and workers with disabilities, have labor protections in place. So in a nutshell, our work is fueled by a vision that all working people will experience basic economic security, dignity on the job, and greater opportunity for themselves and the next generation. Our goal is to ensure that workers, regardless of work status, have equal rights to labor protections. Social protections are decoupled from work status and guaranteed to all, and workers shape the policies and economic models that affect their lives. Therefore, we identify and invest in efforts that expand pathways to build worker voice and influence in our changing economy. We address these issues in three specific ways: modernize the social contract and labor policies, reimagine capital flows and markets, and foster more responsible technology and business innovation. I will briefly touch on the first two and place a spotlight on technology. But before I jump in, I should also mention that we believe it is critical to shift the narrative about workers and work in our society. We can have the best policy ideas and outstanding organizing happening in our communities. But if we're not shifting the narrative, the prevailing beliefs about our world to reflect the need for labor and social protections for all and the need to center workers, we neglect many opportunities to drive change. All of you here today who are grappling with the future of workers and work are a part of that change. The way we talk about these issues matter. The way we present them matters. The art we make about workers and work matters. It ripples out into our communities and the broader culture. As the nature of work has changed, the social contract that shaped protections and supports aimed at fostering safety and economic security for many workers has become outdated. Today, gig, guest, and part-time workers comprise a growing percentage of the workforce, but inadequate laws and policies leave them with few protections and no social safety net. This is lowering the bar for fair treatment for all workers. The pandemic-driven economic devastation experienced by many working people has made it clear that social protection floors are essential to building back better. Social protection consists of policies and programs designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability by promoting efficient labor markets, diminishing people's exposure to risks, and enhancing their capacity to manage economic and social risks such as unemployment, exclusion, sickness, disability, and old age. Sorry, I need a little water. Today, less than half of the world's population have access to any form of social protection, and less than 1/3 of the world's people benefit from comprehensive systems in line with international labor standards, leaving the vast majority of the world's people unprotected in times of need, from national or global economic shocks, the devastation of global pandemic as we are currently seeing, or extreme weather events. Social security is an important tool to prevent and reduce poverty, inequality, social exclusion, and social insecurity. It is a critical tool to promote equal opportunity and gender and racial equality and disability justice, and to support the transition from informal to formal employment. We are glad to see the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, a group of over 200 civil society organizations and trade unions leading on this issue by calling on governments around the world to support low-income countries to expand and improve their social protection systems through the establishment of a global fund for social protection. This fund will enable low-income countries to implement national social protection systems that ensure income protection for all by providing temporary co-financing and facilitating access to technical support. They are working with International Chamber of Commerce since businesses are recognizing how bad it is for business if these types of social protections are not in place. They now know that there are too many people left vulnerable, which ultimately hurts businesses. Businesses are also stepping up to do their part, particularly in ensuring they comply and exceed basic labor protections. We are heartened to see business leaders such as Dan Schulman of PayPal, who after learning that some 60% of their entry-level and hourly employees were struggling to make ends meet, chose to increase worker pay and decrease health costs. Fair wages can often mean workers are less reliant on social safety nets. Financial capital is playing an outsized role in structuring the economy. Investors, large and small, shape outcomes for a wide range of stakeholders through their investment decisions. For instance, downward pressures caused by newer capital models are giving rise to the gig economy, which in turn disincentivizes companies from investing in their workers at the expense of long-term value. I'm building long-term value, sorry. More broadly, current capital models typically force companies to focus on quick turnaround profits that benefit shareholders instead of a broader set of stakeholders. A growing stakeholder movement is working to expand our conception of how capital can be deployed to foster more just economic outcomes. Similarly, the ESG and impact investing space continues to offer models and evidence of how capital can be deployed in ways that offer financial, environmental, and social returns. We need to rethink how we orient capital flow to ensure that investors take into account the voices of workers whose lives will be shaped by their investment strategies. At Ford, we're exploring how workers can influence pension funds, which are said to hold combined assets in excess of $4 trillion in the US, to shift financial markets towards driving better business practices and result in improved working conditions. For instance, we're partnering with the Connecticut Treasurer to do just that. On technology, I would like to highlight and counter 3 myths and outline opportunities for action. So myth number 1, technology and innovation fosters economic opportunity and shared prosperity. Digital technologies in particular have opened up new opportunities for how we connect with others, develop and share information, and create value. The rise of digital technologies and tech-driven business models in the workplace can lead to improvements in the nature and quality of work. They can be used to simultaneously offer workers greater safety and dignity and employers increased value and profitability. Reality is that this has not always been the case. Many of these tech-driven business models upend the relationships between employers and workers, transfer risks to workers, and create information asymmetries that foster economic inequities. So, given the challenges we have seen, I want to share this case study of a grantee partner that we support. So given these challenges that drivers experience with rideshare companies, we've been excited about the opportunity to provide some seed funding to a tech company called Driver's Seat. Driver's Seat uses technology to empower gig workers to capture the value of the data they create, while challenging the deep informational asymmetries that manifest in current platform work. They sought to respond to 2 problems. First, they found that rideshare drivers often missed out on earning opportunities, wasted time, and incurred extra expenses because they did not have market and personal performance data they needed to make good business decisions. Second, they also found that local and state policymakers did not have the data that would help them ensure rideshare business practices were fair to all stakeholders. The driver's seat solution enables drivers to collect and learn from their own data. Drivers can also share that data with the public sector actors who can use that data to set standards. In San Francisco, the city government was able to draw on driver's seat data to better understand working conditions of rideshare drivers. So the opportunity here is that when navigating how technology is changing the nature of work, the important question to ask is simply, who benefits? At whose expense are we innovating around value generation? Does the application of new technology or shifts in the organization of work speed up the concentration of wealth into the hands of a select few, or does it allow workers to get a fair share of the wealth they are producing? New technologies have great potential to create greater economic opportunity and outcomes. However, we need to be intentional about fostering opportunities for these technologies and models to thrive. This brings me to myth number 2. Worker organizations are anti-tech. I want to dispel the myth that worker organizations, or unions are anti-tech. That is simply not true. In many cases, they take issue when tech is deployed and adopted in ways that amplify and scale business practices or long-standing problems that hurt workers, such as erratic scheduling or volatile pay. For example, we know racial and gender discrimination in hiring exists. Algorithms have the potential to scale this discrimination if we fail to actively manage and design against that. Therefore, workers are often on the front lines working to mitigate these types of harms. So the reality is that many worker organizations are fundamentally hopeful that the promise of technology, they believe technology can be good. Rather than wait on the tech industry to build the tech they need, workers have increasingly been rolling up their sleeves and becoming investors in tech developers. So by way of an example, domestic workers are a critical part of the care infrastructure that enables many of us to look after our children, parents, and loved ones. Ai-jen Poo of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, one of our grantee partners, describes it as the work that makes all other work possible. Yet domestic work remains undervalued within our economy. Most domestic workers do not have access to benefits and paid leave. Moreover, since these types of benefits are often tied to employers, the precarity associated with this kind of work often means that in rare cases where domestic workers receive benefits, they are often unable to aggregate or maintain them. So NDWA sought to address this problem by creating a digital product that extends the safety net to domestic workers. Alia Benefits is a portable benefits solution that enables employers and clients to contribute towards a domestic worker's benefits account and ties those benefits to their individual worker and not the job. So again, the opportunity here is that workers want to partner with technologists, entrepreneurs, and others in developing technologies that improve work. We invite you to join in this world-building project. The third myth is that the technological changes we are experiencing are inevitable and ultimately result in a zero-sum game. The ubiquity and rapid pace of technological innovation can often lead us to believe that technology is destiny. Prevailing incentives and the race to innovate often sets us up to set out winners and losers. Reality, technology is not this unstoppable, predetermined phenomena that happens to us. The role the United States and other advanced economies have played on the forefront of technological innovation indicates that as a global society, we can and must shape technology. And when we fail to intentionally make choices around technologies, we have found that they can replicate harms that have devastating consequences, particularly among vulnerable and marginalized communities, such as algorithmic bias. So an example, in the retail sector, many businesses use scheduling software to manage their labor force. The scheduling algorithms typically map out worker schedules based on business trends, expected sales, the weather, etc., often without input from workers. This process leads to scheduling variability and unpredictability, where workers who are often kept on part-time schedules never know how much they might make in any given month, or unable to take on additional work to supplement their incomes or make advanced plans for family care needs. Unfortunately, too many retail businesses believe that their financial bottom lines will be impacted by utilizing more stable employee scheduling practices. A few years ago, Gap Incorporated conducted a stable scheduling pilot where employees could provide input on their employee schedules, received more consistent weekly schedules, and could easily swap schedules, amongst other things. They found that more stable scheduling practices increased median sales and labor productivity. On the other hand, poor execution, high turnover, and low employee engagement were found to be hidden costs associated with the unstable scheduling algorithms in the US. This is a win-win example of how technology can be used to improve job quality while benefiting both workers and employers. So the opportunity here is that we need to be intentional about questioning our assumptions, understanding the true hidden costs of inequitable workplace technologies, and seeking out win-win solutions. This moment in our collective history indicates that we must make choices that ensure technology improves economic security, opportunity, and dignity for all working people. Technology can mutually benefit a broad set of stakeholders, employers, workers, consumers, and investors alike, when they all have a say in shaping technology design, development, implementation, and financing, as well as the policies that govern technologies in the workplace. In reflecting on these myths, realities, and opportunities, we can see that new technologies have great potential to generate new wealth. The concentration of wealth and power in our global economy will determine how innovative technologies are deployed and in whose interest they operate. The future of work will be determined by who wields power and for what purposes. So the question for us are, will we use that wealth to create opportunity and economic mobility as we design the future, the work of the future? Will we use technology to further economic social inequality, or will we harness technology to improve living standards and create decent work? The Future of Work Commission, established by the ILO, developed a set of recommendations in which they called for a human-centered agenda for the future of work that strengthens the social contract by placing people and the work they do at the center of economic and social policy and business practice. This agenda will require investments in people's capabilities, the institutions of work, and decent and sustainable work. Decent work, according to the ILO, embodies people's aspirations for their working lives. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace and social protections for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize, and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. Among international policymakers, there has been an increased urgency to deliver quality jobs along with social protection and respect for rights at work to achieve sustainable, inclusive economic growth and eliminate poverty. This is a space ripe for innovation. I would be remiss if I failed to mention that these challenges, opportunities, and mandates still, sit against the backdrop of a global pandemic that has upended work and life as we know it. This moment has laid bare the results of decades of growing inequality and compounded it, taking disproportionate toll on the poor, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and others who were already marginalized before the crisis. But this moment of crisis is also lined with enormous opportunities. Such a recovery must include the creation of good jobs and the pathways for more workers to access good jobs. And crucially, it must also be rooted in a vision and principles of economic dignity for working people. This is why Ford co-launched several initiatives that aim to address the economic impacts of COVID-19. Examples include the Families and Workers Fund, which has brought together a very diverse range of funders, from tech funders to corporate funders to social justice funders that are focused on facilitating direct relief and lasting structural change for workers. This is now a $38 million fund that is really making a difference in communities across the country. Additionally, in light of the devastation we are seeing in the arts sector, particularly among artists who labor and toil to produce much of what we enjoy, we worked with over 15 foundations and donors to launch the America's Cultural Treasures Initiative. This is a $150 million initiative aimed at ensuring arts communities, particularly among those who have been historically marginalized, underfunded, and excluded, are able to survive and thrive. This is a time where we have to choose. If we're going back to the status quo that was not good for the overwhelming majority of working families, or whether we will use this opportunity to create real structural change that we need to rewrite the rules in the environment, jobs, healthcare, immigration, and economic systems to allow everybody to live healthy, safe, and dignified lives today and into the future. And workers must be seen as critical stakeholders in our economy and in the private sector. We need to partner with workers to design and shape jobs, policies, and economic models that affect their lives. This can ensure all workers can work and contribute with respect. To ensure that we can advance an equitable economic recovery and that the future of work truly makes all of our lives better, not just the lives of a few, we need everyone at the table working together. So where do we go from here? Reimagining and designing a future characterized by more equitable prosperity and economic security for all will require shifts in our perspectives, conversations, and practices. Practically, we need to move towards a more authentic multi-stakeholder modus operandi and grapple with questions such as who benefits and at whose expense. We need business, tech, academia, workers, government, and philanthropy working to ensure we build back stronger and create good jobs and economic pathways that benefit workers today and for generations to come. We need a truly multi-stakeholder approach that ensures workers are engaged in the development of economic recovery plans at all levels, alongside employers, consumers, and investors, that they're involved in the design, implementation, financing, governance of new technologies, that workers are involved in the creation of decent jobs and shaping the work of the future, and that workers are engaged in building out a new social contract and new social protection systems. Many universities and other academic institutions have provided important research, analysis, and convening opportunities to explore some of these themes in more depth. This is a place where many of you can dig in. So as I close, I hope these reflections are helpful as you continue to explore the future of workers and work. We are in a moment of great transformation. Not everything is broken. These challenges are lined with many opportunities to imagine a new set of workers' rights, the new policies we need to ensure social protections for workers today, and how technology can be harnessed to create opportunities for working people to live dignified lives. We need to think critically and more creatively about the tables we are setting and about how we might center workers and their priorities in business models, practices, and decision-making processes. We need to adopt a human-centered perspective and practice that consistently asks, who is missing from this conversation? How can we make this more equitable? The current moment and discourse we're experiencing in the greater society is creating space for a different kind of engagement. So let's roll up our sleeves and do the hard work together. I'm happy to be in conversation and lean into these questions and themes with you. Thank you.
Wow, I'll just pause for a moment for people to join me in a virtual applause. And let you get a little water. So thank you so very much, Sarita, for that incredibly rich and evocative talk that really spurs us to imagine, narrate, and be allies in the creation of a future of work centered around workers and their future work and livelihoods more generally. And I also really appreciate you reminding us of the opportunities in this moment as well. Ever since Arundhati Roy wrote that piece early on in the pandemic as the pandemic as portal, I've had different relationships to it over the past now, 14 months. Well, she probably wrote it in the summer, but sometimes it seems so right and sometimes it seems so impossible. But you made a very convincing case for, and I think, yeah, that one of the things we've been talking about are the possibilities that might emerge that we couldn't have imagined actually before the pandemic. So as you know, and I think the other folks in the audience know, faculty from across the UT campus have been working together for nearly a year to try to shift thinking, even in a very shifting moments, but to try to shift thinking about the future of work in a variety of ways. And we have been organized around 5 clusters, and now they kind of seem natural, but coming up with them was very difficult because they overlap in so many ways and also can't possibly cover everything. And so a number of people have been involved in multiple clusters as we've moved along. But you touched on all of them, and that's really terrific. So just a reminder for folks who this might be the first meeting or just need a reminder of where it is. Sarah can put into the chat a link to the homepage of the website that has the description of each of the clusters. And so now I'd like to briefly introduce people from each of those clusters to say about their work, a word about their work in conversation with you. And I'm going to introduce them alphabetically, but I might call on them in some different order. And Sarah, I'm not going to do long introductions, I'll just give their titles. Sarah can drop them into the chat as well. So Kamran Ali has been working with primarily with our Global South cluster and thinking about work across the Global South. And I must say that we've tried to include that in all of the clusters, but we also thought that there should be some specific attention to that. Kamran is professor of anthropology, Middle East studies, and Asian studies, and is the former chair of the South Asia Institute. Mechele Dickerson has been with our Essential Work cluster. Mechele is Arthur Muller Chair in Bankruptcy Law and Practice at the law school and also University Distinguished Teaching Professor. Min Kyung Lee has been involved with our AI and Technology cluster, and which we all of these have had different names at some points, but we've tried to say critical approaches to AI and technology to get at some of those assumptions you mentioned. Ann Lewis is a documentary filmmaker and associate professor of practice in the Department of Radio and Television and Film. And Sharmila Rudrappa is professor of sociology, And just to say, Anne has been with the cluster on future of artistic labor and the humanities. And Sharmila Rudrappa, who's professor of sociology and the current director of the South Asia Institute, has been the leader for the care work cluster. So I think that we'll start in working our way back in terms of getting some thoughts and responses to the talk. And that means we'll start with Sharmila.
My video. Thank you, Sarita. That was such an inspirational and wonderful talk. And I love that you focused on the future of workers, the people, rather than the processes themselves. I'm, as you, Karen, already said, I'm coordinating the future of work of a care work cluster. And I think one of the conversations that we've begun having that's really been very central to the cluster is thinking through the fact that the current crisis that we see in care work is not necessarily so current at all. This has been ongoing. You could say this is something that has started with capitalism itself, in terms of children working on assembly lines, to, eventually, notions of the family wage coming into play, thinking about who does the care, right? And in terms of social reproduction, along with production on the shop floor. But for us, I think in the care work cluster, we've really been thinking about the crisis in care work that starts about from around the 1970s on, right? With structural adjustment in the global South, and the kinds of adjustments and economic shocks in the US, coupled with second wave feminism that is driving women into the workforce within the US, and there being a care deficit within the household, especially, and we need to think about this as nuclear heterosexual households, and the deficit of care for children there, which then, floods workers coming in from the third world because of structural adjustment, right? This has been so beautifully documented, especially by women of color. I'm thinking about Shelley Colin, who writes this beautiful article on stratified reproduction, where children in the third world then are left with no care. I would like to, at some level, highlight that the children who were left with no care in these various global South countries actually moved into upper middle class households within these global South countries to take care of upper middle class children within these households, right? So there's that kind of ways by which their mothers may have moved out to do other kinds of caring. The children then move into upper middle class households within these countries. So I'd like for us to really think about not just the kinds of wages that happen and waged work, but really think about unwaged work as well that happens and is so central to the future of work. So much of the work that is done today is actually unwaged and unrecognized. And the battle really is to even recognize it as work, right? And so for those of us doing work in the care work cluster, we'd like to think about work as care work as the thinking about caring, right? The intellectual work that goes into caring, the doing of caring, right? And then also the feeling with caring that comes with caring work. So, this is Hilary Rose, who talks about the head, the heart, and the hands, right? And to really think about this, not just in terms of technology and the kinds of technological advances that are going on, but really thinking about the various sectors, whether it is domesticas, whether it is children taking care of other children within households and doesn't get recognized as work, right? Whether it is doctors or whether it's nurses or LVNs. So, our cluster has really been grappling with these kinds of questions. And it seems that, some of the tensions that we feel is thinking about radical caring and what that means, and whether, work itself at some level can be reorganized into becoming much more radical, right? Is infusing thinking, doing, feeling together, not just with care work, but with various other kinds of work. So I'm going to end my comments here. I'm sure we'll have plenty of other time to build on this. And I'd love to hear what other clusters have been doing as well.
All right, I think I'll ask Mechele Dickerson to speak next, because actually a lot of our discussion about essential work and care work have not surprisingly taken place together. And in fact, we're even going to have a joint event on it later this week. So Mechele, you want to talk about your work on essential work and the cluster's work on essential work and your thoughts on the talk?
Well, the talk was terrific. So Sarita, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk like really, really fast because they didn't give me enough time to cover all of the responses I'd like to give to you. So I like the way that you sort of framed your talk. How can academics, business, government respond to the challenges that we're facing right now? And I'll say that I'm hoping to be sort of part of that effort to, dig in, roll up my sleeves, as you've told us all to do. I'm working on a paper that looks at the disaster and how we have treated essential workers during the pandemic, and to sort of suggest better ways of handling this for the next pandemic, because we know there is going to be another pandemic. So who knows how US laws or policies will respond to the next pandemic. But one thing is clear. We can no longer deny the value that essential workers add to the US economy. We may not have known they existed. They may have been invisible before. They are now quite visible. We also can't ignore how they facilitate the lives of higher income Americans who are able to safely work from home while they worked outside of the home. They had to work in face-to-face, often unsafe environments. I love that you mentioned ESG, because that may be the game changer. As Exxon may have realized this past week in the board meeting when, as you know, they lost 2 board seats to the capital, the equity firm. So when I talk about the essential workers, I think we need to think of them in terms of 2 groups. There are the essential workers and the frontline essential worker. And the reason I make that distinction is for the essential workers, they can be and often are higher income. They have economic dignity when they work, and many of them have had rising income since the 1980s. In contrast, the frontline essential workers are more likely to be brown and Black people, women, and earn less than $15 an hour. They face a lifetime of precarity, insecurity, and stagnant income. When you talked about sort of the fissured economy, one good thing about much of the work they perform is that it can't be globally outsourced, but it can be domestically outsourced. So many of them end up either as independent contractors or working for temporary agencies. And so an example I'll use to sort of tie together your comment about we have to make sure that we sort of get to a win-win solution. You mentioned it with the, I forget the name of it, but the drive-in company, I think. So if we think of an essential worker at a nursing home who isn't a full-time worker in the sense of not an employee of the nursing home, but is a full-time worker either as an independent contractor or works through a temporary agency. They were not allowed to get the same COVID testing early. They were not allowed to get to the front of the line of the COVID vaccine as the full-time employees were. And that's just stupid, right? So it is a win-win to say, let's treat these workers, though they are not classified as employees, as if they are employees, because it's good for your bottom line, right? You keep the patients or the customers, your clients, whatever you call the people in the care facilities, safe. And also it's good for marketing. Families are going to be more willing to put their loved ones in a care facility if they feel that the facility is going to be safe. And if you were saying one group of employees get to be treated one way, but the other group doesn't, that's not really good for business. And so when we think in terms of when I think in terms of the essential frontline workers, even if they are classified as employees, They were deemed essential, but of course treated as if they were dispensable. So we think of the workers in the meat packing plants. They were treated abominably. Many of them were undocumented workers. They were not members of labor unions. They didn't feel that they had the right to sort of complain. If you complain, maybe you report it to immigration. Many of them didn't have paid sick leave. And so you have people that are working, doing essential work, but you're not treating them as if they're essential. You're treating them as if they're quite dispensable. So, the good thing about being an essential frontline worker is you got to continue to earn income throughout the pandemic because you knew you could always go to work. The bad thing, of course, is the luck of being able to work exposed you to significantly higher risk of being sick or potentially even dying. So I'm gonna stop now because I know it's going to be on my 2 minutes, but I really loved your talk.
Thank you, Sharmila and Mechele. Why don't we hear from Kamran about how some of these issues have played out across the global South? And I know that's a huge region or a huge part of the world, but you can pick up on whatever you like. And then there are a couple of questions in the chat, so I think maybe we'll pause and focus on these issues before we move on. You need to unmute yourself, Kamran.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarita, for that wonderful manifesto for all of us for the future. And I hope we can all join you and, as colleagues said, roll up our sleeves. When I was listening to you, and as you know, we're all representing the entire pop-up group, but the area that I've been more responsible, or the colleagues that I've been working with, are basically it's Global South, and all the things that you have said in terms of subcontracting and issues around the reduction in collective bargaining and the issue of protections and rights and all those kinds of things have been very much part and parcel of the last few decades. I'll come to this at the end, but when I was listening to you, I just sort of was thinking, because my earlier work was on the Middle East, and one of the things from the late 19th century, but then this thing comes up again in World Bank documents in the 80s, was there are too many Egyptians in Egypt. And recently, we all know that China has sort of reversed its notion of idea of, now they have allowed families to have 3 children. The whole argument around the management of reproduction, which was of course management of women's reproductive choices, was because somehow development would not go the exact way if there were too many Egyptians in Egypt. Whereas the way in which it was the reproductive choices or the reproductive health or the body of the female in the Global South, that had to be the focus of this kind of thing. But now we have realized that we need those bodies because we need workers. Otherwise, in an aging population, we won't have young people to work. So I was really thinking about future of work also in terms of what it would mean in terms of who will again slowly and gradually sort of face the burden of producing and reproducing future workers. But that's sort of an aside. The other thing also, which in the Global South is a major issue, and again, if I talk about China, one of the things that has that we sometimes don't think about, even so the last 20-30 years, one of the arguments about China is who will feed China. You see the whole issue of population and the whole issue of the pavementization and cementization of agricultural land, and the way in which agricultural workers in the Global South have sort of come under pressure, not only in terms of unequal work conditions, but the way in which agricultural land is now part of various kinds of speculation and an urbanization of, this is the other side, right? And because of that, the move towards the cities and even migrating abroad in labor regimes or in kinds of areas where there's very little protection, and most of the people are working, as you yourself said, in contractual jobs in informal sector, and the states are more and more receding from any kind of social responsibility or safety net. And these are not very different from, maybe they're exaggerated, because at least in Europe and to a degree, to a lesser degree in the United States, there are certain kinds of places or safety nets or social policy implementation that help some people really falling through. Although one would argue that in Thatcherite England and the Reagan United States, those kinds of union, we all remember the coal miner strike in England in the 80s, and the way Reagan sort of said, oh, the miracle of unemployment is so low, all that, but where would the job go? The job went to exactly what you were saying, to the consumption sector or sectors which had very little protection. What I'm trying to say is that in that history is also the history that as we go through this program and manifesto that you have so amazingly elaborated for us, we have to also remember the history of those people in the global South whose struggle for dignity or decent labor or a way in which they fought for collective bargaining were curtailed by certain kinds of, unfortunately, labor, AFL-CIO or CIA, whatever you call them, were very much part of that, right, in the Cold War context. I'm saying in this new era, if there, like what happened in the 90s, and especially in the garment industry and the kind of pressure in the global South about certain kind of working conditions and wage conditions, and the boycotts we did or the struggles that happened, I think similar kind of connections have to be made if these labor standards or these workers of the future with a dignified working conditions, then the partners, the colleagues, and in the global South have to be brought along, but not under the terms that were actually implemented to break up collective bargaining and union and the struggle, rather to really enhance and give the kinds of protections that are available, or we hope to be available, or the bright future we're talking about in the global North. So I think that is something we have to talk about. And the gendered aspect of it, not only in the workforce, where a lot of women are there and living vulnerable and precarious life, where a lot of men are underemployed or unemployed. And as Sharmila was also suggesting, women are very much part of the informal, unprotected workforce, but also the demands on this kind of demographic demands to be producers and reproducers. This is sort of also I'm really worried about, that all of a sudden the rhetoric would change once you have to curtail your reproduction. Now you have to in this way sort of overpopulate us because we have too many. And those kinds of things also on a macro level one has to think through. Maybe I wasn't very coherent, but thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thanks you for sharing your views. You're mute now.
It takes a village to unmute each other. Thank you, Kamran. We have quite a few issues on the table now, and although nice overlap, let me just say from the chat, Kanika Batra has put a comment in there asking if we can expand the notion. So actually she's combining Sharmila and Kamran's focuses. Can we expand the notion of care work to include unwaged, often unrecognized activism, which often comes at great personal cost? I'm thinking of women's and LGBT and other social movements in the global South. And also, Imelda Munoz sent me a question which is related to Mechele's comments as well. What do you think about the essential worker label that's been used during the pandemic in terms of its utility has it been useful or divisive in building coalitions among the working class? So in 30 seconds, no, maybe you can't cover everything, I know, but maybe you can pick out a few of the issues you'd like to respond to for, let's say, 5 minutes.
Sure, happy to. You were talking to me, right? I'm just making sure.
Yes.
Cut out for a second, so just making sure. No, these are all lovely comments, and these are moments when I wish we were in person, could engage in long conversations about this. So a few things. First of all, Sharmila, to your point, absolutely. When I think about structural adjustment programs, and I think we need an adjustment to our global care infrastructure. That's what we need right now. And, what you were talking about around the intellectual work, the doing, the feeling, is so critical. And, this is a deeply personal issue for me. And I know there are some people who've asked about, are we talking about paid caregiving? What about unpaid caregiving? And I think some of the efforts I've been a part of around the care work in general and the care economy has been about ensuring we're talking about the full spectrum of care. So that's not only does that mean childcare and elder care, it also means paid and unpaid caregiving. And I'm a family caregiver to a father with Alzheimer's, and I totally personally understand the intellectual work, the doing work, and the deep feeling work that is involved in caregiving. So I think that what's amazing about the moment we're in is that we are actually before our eyes watching a literal cultural shift happen, where people are beginning to acknowledge the pandemic, actually alerted people to their own personal stories about care, and recognizing that it's not just a personal issue, that there are societal forces at play, and there's structural change needed to really ensure that we're addressing the breadth of care giving needs, care needs, and this question of the workforce itself. So I feel incredibly hopeful that we're seeing a cultural shift where we're actually valuing and making visible care in our lives in a way that I certainly have not seen in my lifetime. So I think that will open up a lot of opportunities. And it's certainly not just a US phenomena, it's happening globally. So I'm really excited about what's in store for us and the possibilities when we think about a global care economy, how we think about care and caregiving in that context. Mechele, I loved what you said about frontline essential workers. And, actually many of our grantee partners at the Future of Workers program are in fact frontline essential worker organizations. And we have been really supporting the Always Essential campaign to really help build out the vision, to helping them build out the vision and the narrative support and work to really take advantage of this opening and this moment right now, where again, this is a workforce or a set of workers that have been undervalued and invisible, that are finally, we're saying it was one thing to clap for workers, it's another to actually make real change that impacts their lives. And so I'm really hopeful about the Always Essential work that's happening. Health and safety has been such an interesting place where we have seen an opening. When I talked about the multi-stakeholders, having health and safety experts come together with frontline essential workers who are telling their stories and talking about the policy shifts and the changes in workplaces and business norms that need to change, and bringing business leaders into those conversations to begin to really say, we need to be serious about health and safety. So I think there's lots of openings like that right now that are really incredible. And I think this question that was asked about, is it a unifying terminology or not? At this stage, it's been unifying across the working class. I think the question is, will that be true a year from now? So how to really use this particular moment that we're in, where it's still a very unifying orientation, to really drive through the kinds of changes that are needed to support frontline essential workers. And then what will happen in the future, I don't know, I'm not a fortune teller, but my sense is that it won't be a term or a label that will last and stay with us forever. So I think there's a lot to figure out from the perspective of culture and narratives around how we continue to lift up these really important and often insecure workers. And again, I talked about this, but I can't tell you enough that we're in a moment when the conversations about contracted employees, like, we could repeat history and create a whole new set of exclusions that will bar so many women and people of color and workers with disabilities if we are not careful. And so the conversation about flexibility and economic security, the way it's juxtaposed right now, is not okay, and we shouldn't accept that narrative, and that we can in fact have economic security and flexibility that speaks to people's caregiving needs, their broader life needs, and that it can all still uphold the kinds of labor standards and protections that are needed. So much to figure out on that front. And finally, Kamran, I wanted to say I loved your management of reproduction question, and I want to digest that and sit with it because it's so true. And just say, I think the partnerships right now are exactly what we need. And at Ford, through our global programming, we are funding a lot of the large informal worker networks, the WeGo network, street vendors, HomeNet, home workers, global waste pickers, domestic workers, and many others, and really figuring out how to support them in forging the partnerships with the International Trade Union Confederation and many of the unions that you're talking about, or in the garment sector, garment unions, to kind of think together about the kinds of ways to leverage and open up space in the global policymaking arena, as well as the conversations around capital flow and markets and standards that we can get built in. So I see a lot of opportunity for those kinds of partnerships right now, without dismissing the history that has existed, but really thinking about the opportunity moving forward. And really, women's leadership in that realm has been tremendous. And we're seeing a lot of appetite for trade union women leaders and leaders of the informal worker networks wanting to quite literally be in cohorts together, to do the learning together, to really think about strategies together. And so we're certainly investing in some of those partnership building opportunities. So I'll stop there, Karen, and let you go back to more questions and thoughts.
Great. I think I'll pick up on your discussion of the need to claim, maybe continue to claim words like essential and flexible, which I think that's a big reclaiming that's needed. And I use that as a segue to hear from Ann Lewis, who is very much interested in, well, she can tell you what she's interested in, but I think certainly in terms of changing the narrative, I can just say she's involved in it. Yeah.
Right. Well, first of all, I thank you so much, Sarita, for the talk, and all of my other colleagues in the Rappaport Center for the opportunity to talk about these things. For me, it really is a question of who's at the table. And I want to stress that a bit before I talk about artistic labor. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and who is going to make this demand, if not masses of workers and poor people across the globe? And so it's not so much for me a question of inclusion in a policy discussion. It's much more important in a way for people to have autonomy and to have those discussions and the possibility of organizing within their own areas. And so I just wanted to mention that before I continue, because I think we all fall into policy discussions, inclusion of workers, without understanding what you so eloquently said, Sarita, about centering workers. You know, and how we do that, I think, has to grant workers an understanding of their agency and their potential for organizing and their potential for building coalition between workers, unwaged workers, informal workers, and poor people. So, artistic work. And I just am going to talk a little bit quickly about that, because I think it's very, very important. So statistics estimate losses of 2.7 million jobs in the US in creative occupations like musicians, visual artists, filmmakers, performers, designers, all the collaborators in 2020, with a disproportionate impact on the performing arts, 50% job loss in there. So dancers go, for example, from slightly over 10% unemployment rate to over 50%. Actors go from around 25% unemployment to 50%. And of course, there's a disproportionate impact in African-American, Latina, regional, working class, poor, artistic communities. It's particularly interesting to me to look at those starting numbers. And here we see how the pandemic reveals and exaggerates the existing problems of chronic unemployment, contingency, lack of a social safety net, underpay, overwork, and vast inequities among those who work in the arts and culture, I might add. Nearly every artist in this country by necessity makes a livelihood outside of the arts. Teaching usually is contingent faculty or as low-paid instructors, waiting tables, driving Ubers, as we found out in previous session when a musician Uber driver spoke with us. And akin to other exploiters in the neoliberal economy, commercial gain for just a few people impacts the entire field, both in terms of funding and in terms of distribution to increase the wealth of a few. In addition, cultural appropriation, even of radical artistic ideas and marginalized cultures, has been found to be highly profitable for the super rich on a global scale. But if we stick that painting back on the easel or imagine actors and dancers working with each other to create an experience, perhaps only for the wealthy and those with leisure, or see the collaboration inherent in any film, the story is not a romantic one about the muse and the artist. Artists find themselves unable to sustain life at the most basic levels. And we included the humanities in our cluster because the issues are similar, intrinsic social value, only as long as uncommercialized, really, where labor is exploited for the gains of a few and products are sold based on something unique or exotic, as in cultural appropriation. So we sponsored a performance, a discussion, and many of these questions were also added to by my co-chair, Robin Moore. The big question is, what can artists and cultural workers do now, and humanists do now, to change this for the future? And I think that has to be answered in part by what Sarita has said, by talking about the needs and aspirations of workers in these areas. And so it has to be a collective decision. So the question is, for me, can we join in collaboration between these areas and with groups like the Ford Foundation to have a real understanding and a real discussion of what the needs are, both in the social safety net and in questions of employment.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm just going to declare now that we are going to go until 2:35, if Sarita, if you're able. Obviously we understand if people need to leave. I also just want to say there's an incredible amount of experience in this room, so in this virtual room. So thank you all for attending. And I know that there are questions in the chat. Not everyone's going to be able to get in, but we want to encourage you to put comments, questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that Sarita gets them, and also we can put them up with the video when we post it. I turn now to Min, who has been very involved with the ANI technology cluster. She already informed me that she's going to end her comment with a question, so that's great because you have that as well as the one from Anne. Min?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much, Sarita, for a very inspirational talk. I know we are running out of time, so I'll try to keep this comment very brief. I particularly really like your debunking myths about tech for future work. And then I thought that the action items were on point. So we actually, AI and Technology Cluster, had a workshop yesterday, and a lot of themes that we discussed was in line with the mission of your organization, and a lot of initiative. Like we covered like how to use data and technology to identify future opportunities, growth opportunities for workers. There was discussion about smart tools that empower blue-collar workers, as well as how to use robotics and healthcare AI, and how we can integrate it into the workplaces with the consideration of workers, etc. So I'm really inspired and encouraged by all this great research project on like AI and tech that centers workers. One big challenge that I think is ahead of us, and something that we already observed in some of the work for like fairness in AI, for example, is that there's a great techniques, research outcomes and products, and criticism about where tech is going in terms of work and labor. But effecting these changes and implementing, like transferring this idea has not been easy. Like, for example, I talked to informally some big tech companies, and they all say this is a great idea, but it's very close to our business model. So we cannot disclose any information and data they have. And it's difficult, it's rare to see where the big players kind of are adapting these ideas into their work. So I'm curious, like, because a lot of audience here is academics, like what advice do you have in terms of us? What can we do to actually transfer these great research outcomes into the fields so that we can actually start effecting the changes?
All right, Sarita.
Okay, so there's a couple of pieces. So first of all, Anne, thank you so much. And I want to double down on the point you made about autonomy and agency and voice and vision and all of that, because fundamentally this is about power. And we should be very clear. It's about power, who has power, who does not have power to really shape the future here. And so I think your points are well taken, and it's a big part of what we grapple with at a foundation that's committed to combating inequality. The reason we even have a program focused on work and workers is really understanding there is deep imbalance, and part of the work we need to do is I kind of like to think of it as like, how do we expand the toolbox for workers to really shift the terrain and be able to lead with agency and voice in the way that we know is necessary. So really appreciate you raising that. In terms of the artistic work, I just want to lift up that when the pandemic hit, actually at Ford, our team focused on creativity and free expressions, immediately jumped on how do we support cultural workers, and moved a lot of resources and support. And in fact, what we're seeing in the field is the creation of these creator groups. And one of the things we're trying to figure out with that program, but it'd be interesting with you, Anne, to think through as well, is how do we make sure when we're talking about social protections, when we're talking about new sets of labor protections and standards, that we are including cultural workers, creative workers in that conversation. And so there's a lot that's starting to take root, and I'm really hopeful about, but just want to say that I think that's important. It's also a really important part of, again, how we create culture and narrative shifts, not just because we're talking about people who help create culture, but because broadly speaking, we need to fundamentally change people's perception of who workers are. Most people today don't even identify as workers. And when people think of workers, they think of workers in a factory. They still do not see or embrace a label or even an orientation of a worker. So we have so much work to do to shift. When we're talking about labor standards, who are we talking about? When we talk about social protections, who are we talking about? And we need a diversity of the types of workers, including cultural workers, who are part of that, both storytelling and case making about who are workers today. So lots to figure out there. I wanted to just lift up, Min, to your point, that is such an excellent question and such a great challenge that you've put forward. And I think what I would just lift up is that we're one of our grantee partners is partnerships, PAI, partnerships on artificial intelligence. And part of what we're doing with them, it's been important to have a space where private sector, academics, civil society are grappling with this question. So PAI has been an example of where we've been able to help move partners or stakeholders in the conversation and lift up issues like algorithmic bias and some of the many issues that you raised. So I think we're starting to see examples of that. We're also seeing, we actually have invested in a project with IDEO where we're experimenting with what it means to work in partnership across frontline workers and businesses and employers, to really develop new business norms and practices that speak to some of these questions about new technologies in the workplace. I guess my point is what we're recognizing is there aren't enough pilots or case studies of pilots and programs that are being used and then socialized across various sectors to inspire and pull people into this work. So when we said, let's do this small project with IDEO and bring employers together to talk about new technologies and how workers on the front lines can shape and govern those technologies, we were actually quite surprised by how much interest there was, because people don't feel like they have good models of this. So I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities, and happy to talk more offline about where and how we can help make those connections. But I think academics can do so much to help lift up those kinds of examples and help with the case making and get it in front of the right audiences to make sure that we're actually moving forward on the question of technology and workers and workplaces. And one last thing, you talked about smart tools. I can't resist but just say so many of our grantee partners are doing really interesting, like worker groups are doing such interesting work with developing smart tools to support organizing of workers and to support actually in the care workers, supporting the idea of like actually addressing the social isolation that workers face. So lots of really interesting new smart tools being created in the worker sector that would be interesting to kind of really look at and learn more about. Like Work It is an example of that and a few others. Anyway, those are just, I know we're limited on time, but those are a few comments I would offer in response. And I guess I just want to close on my end, Karen, and then I'll hand it back to you just to say thank you for this really rich conversation. I learned a lot in our back and forth, and hope we can continue the discussion. We all need to continue the discussion. And I guess we'll just leave you with a few years ago, before he passed away, I had an opportunity to spend time with a longtime civil rights leader, Vincent Harding, who was a professor at Temple University. And he shared, I asked him, like, how do you stay positive in this moment, like given his history of work and in the midst of great transformations? And he shared a West African proverb with me that I just want to share with you. The proverb is, "We are citizens of a world not yet born." And I find a lot of actually comfort in that it's like a reminder that we do have this blank canvas in front of us on many levels. And sure, there's lines and scribbles, but there's a lot we can do with it to make it the future we want. And so I'm really excited to learn about the work you all are doing and look forward to keep painting that canvas, because we can do something really different here. We just have to remember that we are citizens of a world not yet born, that we want to change. So thank you. Appreciate your time today.
All right. I hate to have the last word because that should be the last word. But I do want to say, again, thank you for, I mean, the adjectives can't do us justice in terms of describing your talk, but I mean, not only was it unbelievably informative and inspiring, but really gave us concrete steps. We thought this was the end of our year of work, but actually the future of this Future of Work project awaits us. And we really appreciate the conversation engagement and look forward to continuing the discussion. I also just want to say thanks to Risha Arumi and Rachel Wasser, who were behind the screen, the scenes doing the PowerPoint, but much more. So we really enjoyed our conversations with you all and learning more about your work and thinking. And finally, Sarah just put on the chat that we have set aside some sessions to try to replicate conferences, which is basically the virtual coffee break. And it's from 3 to 4 today, called Let's Keep Talking. So anybody who wants to come and continue any of the conversations that we've had so far should feel free, and a chance for you to get to know each other as well. And actually now the real finally, if you sent me a question, I will make sure that it makes it into the chat that we put up and that Sarita gets it. If you had a question you didn't have time to put on here before we ran out of time, feel free to email it to me or to Sarah and we will add it to the chat. So again, thank you very, very much, Sarita. And thanks to all of the attendees here. And of course, to our fearless cluster representatives and leaders.